Let's get started. Story number 1.
The cold winter wind howled through the skeletal trees, shaking their brittle branches against the old Victorian house on Evergreen Street. It was New Year's Eve, and the small town of Millfield was buried under a blanket of snow that muffled all sound, creating an eerie stillness. Inside the house, the Dawson family was settling in for the night. They had moved in just a month ago, unaware of the dark history that clung to the house like a shadow. Helen Dawson stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. The warmth of the fire crackling in the living room didn't reach her here, and she shivered despite the layers she wore. The house was drafty, and no matter how much they tried to seal it, cold air seemed to seep in from every corner. Her husband Mark sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone while their 8-year-old daughter Lucy played with her doll near the Christmas tree. The decorations still sparkled, but the festive cheer seemed dimmed, as though the house refused to embrace the holiday spirit. As the clock struck 9, Lucy looked up from her doll and asked, "Mommy, can I stay up until midnight to see the new year?" Helen smiled, but a sense of unease prickled at her skin. "We'll see, sweetheart. You might get too sleepy." Lucy pouted, but didn't argue. She went back to her doll, humming a tune that Helen didn't recognize. The melody was haunting, the notes almost discordant. Helen glanced at Mark, who shrugged, engrossed in whatever he was reading. The first sign came an hour later. A soft knock echoed through the house, barely audible over the wind outside. Helen paused, ladle in hand, and listened. Another knock, this time louder. She walked to the front door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. She opened the door a crack, letting in a gust of icy air. The porch was empty, the snow pristine with no sign of footprints. "Who was it?" Mark asked, looking up from his phone. "No one," Helen replied, closing the door firmly and locking it. Lucy looked up from her doll. "It's the man," she said matter-of-factly. Helen's heart skipped a beat. "What man, honey?" Lucy pointed toward the front window. "The man outside. He's been watching." Mark chuckled nervously. "It's probably just her imagination. Kids see all sorts of things." Helen forced a smile but couldn't shake the feeling that Lucy's words carried a weight beyond mere childish fancy. As the evening progressed, the knocks became more frequent, growing louder each time. Helen and Mark inspected the house multiple times but found no one. Lucy, however, seemed unconcerned, as if she were used to the presence of this unseen visitor. She spoke less and less, her doll now forgotten on the floor. Her humming had stopped, replaced by long, unsettling silences. By 11 o'clock, Helen's nerves were frayed. "Maybe we should call someone," she suggested. Mark shook his head. "And tell them what? That we're scared of a few knocks? It's probably the wind or some kids playing pranks." But Helen wasn't convinced. The knocks weren't random. They had a pattern, deliberate and rhythmic, like someone trying to get their attention. At precisely 11:45 p.m., the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. Helen lit a candle, her hands trembling. Lucy, now sitting cross-legged on the floor, stared at the front door. "He's coming," she whispered. Helen knelt beside her daughter, her voice shaky. "Lucy, who's coming?" "The man," Lucy said, her voice distant, as if she were speaking from somewhere far away. "He wants to come in." The front door rattled violently, as though something or someone was trying to force it open. Mark grabbed the fire poker and moved toward the door. "Who's there?" he shouted. The rattling stopped abruptly. Silence fell, so complete it pressed against their ears. Then, from the other side of the door came a voice, low, guttural, and inhuman. "Let me in." Mark staggered back, his face pale. "Helen, call the police." Helen reached for her phone, but there was no signal. The voice came again, louder this time. "Let me in." Lucy stood up, her eyes glazed and unfocused. "We have to let him in," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the usual warmth. "No." Helen grabbed her daughter, pulling her close. "Stay away from the door." The clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the house. With each chime, the temperature plummeted further until Helen could see her breath. The door burst open, though the locks were still intact. A shadow filled the doorway, tall and formless, its presence sucking the warmth and light from the room. Helen screamed, clutching Lucy tightly, but the girl wriggled free and walked toward the shadow. "Lucy, no!" Mark shouted, dropping the fire poker and lunging for her, but it was as if an invisible barrier had sprung up, holding him back. Lucy stopped inches from the shadow and looked up. "It's okay, Mommy," she said softly. "He just wants to come home." The shadow reached out, a tendril of darkness curling around Lucy's small hand. Helen fought against the unseen force, tears streaming down her face. "Please, don't take her." The shadow hesitated, then turned its faceless head toward Helen. A whisper filled the room, ancient and mournful. "She called me." "No, she didn't," Helen sobbed. The shadow released Lucy and began to recede, but as it did, it spoke one final time. "Not tonight, but I will return." The front door slammed shut and the oppressive cold lifted. The power flickered back on, and the house was silent once more. Lucy collapsed to the floor, unconscious but unharmed. Helen and Mark rushed to her side, relief and terror mingling in their hearts. When Lucy woke the next morning, she remembered nothing of the night before. But Helen and Mark knew they could never forget. The shadow's parting words haunted them, a chilling reminder that their nightmare was far from over. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The snow fell softly, blanketing the world in a hushed stillness. It was New Year's Eve, and the Petersons were hosting their annual celebration at their family cabin deep in the woods. The cabin, an old, sprawling structure with creaky floors and flickering lights, had been in their family for generations. It was said to be haunted, but the Petersons always laughed off the rumors. This year, however, only a small group had gathered. Tom and Claire Peterson, their teenage daughter Lily, and Tom's brother David, who had recently returned from overseas. Their usual crowd of friends and neighbors had declined the invitation, blaming the worsening weather and the unsettling stories that circulated about the cabin. The Petersons ignored the warnings and spent the evening playing board games, laughing, and sharing resolutions by the fireplace. Midnight approached, and the mood was festive, though the wind outside howled with an almost human wail. As the clock struck 11:30, Lily wandered upstairs to retrieve her phone charger. The cabin had always unsettled her, especially the upper floor, which felt colder and darker than the rest of the house. The hallway was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting long shadows that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't explain. She entered her room, grabbed the charger from the nightstand, and turned to leave, but froze. The mirror above her dresser reflected not just her image, but something else. A figure stood behind her, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and shrouded in shadow, its face obscured, but its eyes glowing faintly like embers. Lily spun around, but the room was empty. She let out a shaky laugh, convincing herself it was a trick of the light. She hurried back downstairs, trying to shake the lingering sense of dread. The family continued to enjoy their evening, though Lily couldn't focus. She kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at her. At 11:55, the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the flickering flames of the fireplace. Claire groaned. This storm must have knocked out the lines. Tom got up, fumbling for a flashlight. "I'll check the generator." Lily grabbed his arm. "Dad, don't go out there. It's not safe." Tom smiled reassuringly. "I'll be fine. I've done this a dozen times." He disappeared into the night, leaving the others huddled by the fire. The wind outside grew louder, battering the cabin with an almost rhythmic force. It sounded less like wind and more like fists pounding against the walls. Minutes passed, then half an hour. Tom didn't return. Claire began to panic. He should be back by now. David grabbed a lantern. "I'll go look for him." "No," Lily cried. "There's something out there. I saw it upstairs." David hesitated, but Claire urged him on. "He could be hurt. We can't just sit here." David stepped out into the storm, the door slamming shut behind him. The cabin felt emptier without him, the silence oppressive. Lily and Claire sat close together, neither speaking. The fire crackled weakly, as though struggling against the cold. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from upstairs. Lily's blood ran cold. "Mom, did you hear that?" Claire nodded, her face pale. "Stay here." "No, don't go up there." But Claire was already climbing the stairs, the flashlight beam trembling as she moved. Lily sat frozen, clutching a blanket tightly. The thuds grew louder, followed by a scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. Claire screamed. Lily shot to her feet, her heart pounding. "Mom?" She ran to the bottom of the stairs, but Claire didn't answer. The flashlight lay on the floor, its beam illuminating the empty hallway. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned, expecting to see her father or uncle, but the doorway was empty. The front door creaked open, letting in a blast of icy air. A figure stood there, tall and motionless, its face hidden in shadow. It didn't step inside, but Lily felt its presence pressing against her, suffocating and cold. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed toward her. The door slammed shut, and the wind outside stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. Lily backed away, her mind racing. "Mom? Uncle David?" She ran upstairs, but the hallway was empty. Her mother was gone. So was the strange sound. She checked every room, her panic rising. There was no trace of Claire, David, or even her father. It was as if they had vanished. When she returned to the living room, she found something that hadn't been there before. A single, old-fashioned clock sitting on the mantel. Its hands pointed to midnight, though it didn't tick. Below it was a note scrawled in an unfamiliar hand. "Time resets, but not for all." Lily stared at the clock, the message sending chills down her spine. The fire had gone out completely, leaving her in darkness. She fumbled for her phone, but it was dead. The wind resumed outside, louder and more insistent. Shadows flickered across the walls, though there was no light source. She could feel them moving, circling her, closing in. And then she heard it. Her mother's voice, faint and distant. "Lily. Mom?" She called out, spinning around. "Where are you?" The voice came again, closer this time. "Help me." Lily followed the sound, her fear warring with the desperate hope that her family was still alive. The voice led her to the basement door, which stood slightly ajar. She hesitated, the darkness beyond seeming to pulse with malevolence. "Lily," the voice was pleading now. Summoning all her courage, she pushed the door open and descended the creaking stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to thicken, pressing against her. At the bottom, she found herself in a room she didn't recognize. It was too large to fit beneath the cabin, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected not her image, but scenes of her family. In one mirror, she saw her father wandering through the snow, calling her name. In another, her uncle stood in the woods, staring blankly at a figure that loomed over him. Her mother appeared in the largest mirror, her face pale and terrified as she pounded against the glass. "Lily, help me!" Claire's voice echoed through the room. Lily ran to the mirror, her hands pressing against the cold surface. "Mom, I'm here! How do I get you out?" The mirror cracked, and Claire's image twisted, her face contorting into something unrecognizable. "You can't," the voice growled, no longer her mother's. "They're mine now." The room began to spin, the mirrors shattering one by one. The shadows closed in, and Lily screamed as the darkness swallowed her whole. When the Petersons' neighbors arrived at the cabin 2 days later, concerned by the lack of communication, they found it empty. The fireplace was cold, the table set for a meal that was never eaten. Settled on the mantel sat an old clock, its hands stuck at midnight. Beneath it was a single note. "Time resets, but not for all." The Petersons were never seen again. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The New Year's Eve snowstorm had swept through the small, quiet town of Ravenswood, leaving a desolate silence in its wake. The streets were empty, the shops closed, and a layer of frost clung stubbornly to the windows of every home. On the outskirts of town, nestled against the edge of the sprawling Ashwood Forest, stood the Holloway Estate, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had been abandoned for over a century. Ellie Thatcher knew better than to go near it, but curiosity had always been her weakness. She'd heard the stories from her grandmother, who claimed the house was cursed. The last family to live there, the Holloways, had vanished on New Year's Eve in 1923, leaving behind nothing but uneaten food on the dining table and cryptic messages scratched into the walls. Since then, no one had dared step foot inside. Until now. Ellie wasn't alone in her foolish curiosity. Her best friends, Marcus and Rachel, had spent weeks convincing her to join them. It was a rite of passage, they said, something every local teen should do before leaving for college. They'd planned everything. Flashlights, a pack of snacks, and even a bottle of cheap champagne to toast the new year in what they jokingly called Ravenswood's most haunted house. The three of them trudged through the knee-deep snow, their laughter echoing into the stillness. The sky above was an inky black, dotted with faint stars that seemed distant and indifferent. When the mansion came into view, a hush fell over them. Its towering silhouette loomed against the forest, its once grand facade now crumbling and weather-worn. The broken windows and sagging roof gave it the appearance of a wounded beast, still dangerous despite its age. "Still think this is a good idea?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus grinned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "What's the worst that could happen? Ghosts aren't real." Rachel nudged Ellie's arm. "Come on, it's just a house. We'll take a few pictures, toast to the new year, and be out before midnight." Reluctantly, Ellie followed them up the cracked stone steps. The massive oak door creaked as Marcus pushed it open, revealing a dark, cavernous interior that smelled of decay and damp wood. Their footsteps echoed as they entered, the sounds swallowed by the oppressive silence of the house. The foyer was grand but ruined. A massive chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals dulled by years of neglect. Faded wallpaper peeled away from the walls, revealing the bare wood beneath. A grand staircase, its banister broken in places, spiraled upward into darkness. "This place is incredible," Rachel said, shining her flashlight across the room. "Creepy, but incredible." Ellie's stomach churned. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The shadows seemed too deep, the silence too heavy, as though the house itself were watching them. They moved cautiously through the rooms, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The once elegant parlor was filled with dust-covered furniture, and the dining room still held the remains of a long-abandoned feast. Plates and glasses sat untouched, their surfaces coated in grime. A massive grandfather clock stood in the corner, its hands frozen at 11:55. "Creepy as hell," Marcus muttered, running his fingers over the edge of the dining table. "It's like they just disappeared." Rachel took out her phone and snapped a picture. "This is so cool. Imagine the stories we'll tell when we're old." Ellie wasn't listening. Her attention was drawn to the clock. Something about it felt wrong, though she couldn't explain why. She reached out and touched its face. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and for a moment, she thought she heard something, a faint whisper just at the edge of her hearing. "Ellie?" Rachel's voice broke her trance. "You okay?" She pulled her hand back, nodding. "Yeah, just this place is weird." They decided to explore the upper floors next, though Ellie hesitated. The staircase groaned under their weight, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, but the darkness revealed nothing. The second floor was even colder than the first. The air was thick and musty, and their breaths formed clouds in front of them. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with doors that led to forgotten rooms. Most were locked or empty, but one stood ajar, revealing a child's bedroom. Ellie stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping across the room. It was untouched by time, as though the child who once lived there might return at any moment. A tiny bed with a faded quilt sat in the corner, and a collection of porcelain dolls lined the shelves. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her, and she shuddered. Rachel joined her, picking up one of the dolls. Creepy, but kind of pretty. "Put it back," Ellie snapped, more harshly than she intended. Rachel raised an eyebrow but set the doll down. "Relax. It's just a doll." Before Ellie could respond, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. All three of them froze. "What was that?" Marcus whispered. "Probably just the wind," Rachel said, though her voice trembled. Ellie wasn't so sure. The crash had been deliberate, as though something or someone had thrown something heavy. They hurried back downstairs, their flashlights darting across the walls. Nothing seemed out of place until they reached the foyer. The massive chandelier had fallen, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The front door, which they had left ajar, was now firmly shut. "We need to leave," Ellie said, panic rising in her chest. Marcus nodded, but when he tried the door, it wouldn't budge. He shoved it with all his strength, but it refused to move. "What the hell?" Rachel's phone buzzed in her pocket, making them all jump. She pulled it out, frowning. "That's weird. I just got a text." "From who?" Ellie asked. Rachel's face paled as she read the message. "It's from my number." "What does it say?" Marcus asked. Rachel's hands shook as she held up the screen. The message was short but chilling. "It's almost midnight. Don't look behind you." All three of them turned instinctively, their flashlights illuminating the empty room. Nothing was there, but the air felt heavier, the shadows deeper. "We have to get out of here," Ellie said, her voice barely a whisper. As they turned to find another way out, the grandfather clock began to chime. The sound was deafening, echoing through the house and vibrating in their chests. The hands, which had been frozen at 11:55, now moved rapidly, spinning faster and faster until they stopped at midnight. The final chime faded, and the house went silent. Then, slowly, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere at once, but they grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, until the words became clear. "Why did you come?" Ellie spun around, her flashlight flickering. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, darting in and out of the light. Marcus grabbed her arm, his face pale. "We need to stay together." But the house had other plans. The shadows surged and the air grew icy. Rachel screamed as something yanked her backward into the darkness. Marcus lunged for her, but she was gone. "Rachel?" Ellie shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the cacophony of whispers. Marcus pulled her toward the stairs, his grip tight. "We have to get to the attic. There's a window." They ran, the shadows chasing them. The house seemed to shift around them, the hallways elongating and twisting. By the time they reached the attic door, Ellie was gasping for breath. Marcus shoved the door open, and they scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind them. The attic was filled with old trunks and cobwebs, the air thick with dust. A single window let in a faint glow from the moon, their only source of light. Ellie collapsed against the wall, trembling. "What is happening?" "I don't know," Marcus said, his voice shaky. "But we're getting out of here." He approached the window, but as he reached for the latch, it shattered, the shards flying inward. A freezing wind howled through the room, carrying with it the sound of laughter, low, guttural, and inhuman. Ellie screamed as the shadows surged into the attic, engulfing Marcus. He disappeared into the darkness, his cries fading until there was nothing but silence. Ellie was alone. The whispers surrounded her, growing louder and more insistent. She backed into a corner, her flashlight flickering weakly. The shadows closed in, and for the first time she saw them clearly. Faces, hundreds of them, twisted in agony. "Why did you come?" they demanded, their voices overlapping. "I'm sorry," Ellie sobbed. "I didn't mean to." The shadows surged forward, and the world went black. When the townspeople found the Holloway estate the next day, it was empty. There was no sign of Ellie, Marcus, or Rachel. The only clue was the grandfather clock, its hands frozen at midnight, and a single message scratched into the wall. Some doors should never be opened. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The wind was biting cold on New Year's Eve as Mia pulled her coat tighter around her. The streets of the small coastal town were eerily deserted, the festive lights swaying in the gale but doing little to lift the ominous atmosphere. She glanced at her watch. 11 p.m. An hour until midnight. Mia had always heard rumors about the old lighthouse on the cliff. The townsfolk called it Blackshore Beacon, though no ship had used it in decades. It was said to be haunted, cursed even. People spoke of strange lights that flickered in its windows, despite it being abandoned, and of the long-dead keeper, Edward Harrow, who had vanished mysteriously on New Year's Eve over a century ago. She hadn't planned to come here tonight, but when her phone buzzed with a cryptic text message earlier that evening, curiosity got the better of her. "If you want the truth, come to Blackshore Beacon before midnight." The message came from an unknown number, and despite her better judgment, Mia felt compelled to go. Her grandfather, a sailor who had often spoken of the lighthouse in hushed tones, had disappeared years ago under circumstances the family never understood. If there was even the slightest chance the text held answers, she had to find out. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged and foreboding against the stormy sky. The door, weathered and splintered, hung slightly ajar, swaying with the wind. She hesitated, her breath visible in the icy air. Taking one last look at the desolate road behind her, she stepped inside. The interior was as cold as the night outside, the air thick with the smell of salt and decay. Her flashlight's beam swept across the room, revealing rusted machinery, overturned furniture, and walls covered in strange markings. Symbols and phrases scratched into the paint, their meaning unclear, seemed to pulse with a strange energy. As Mia climbed the spiral staircase, the steps groaned beneath her weight. The sound of the wind outside was muffled, replaced by an eerie silence. Her flashlight flickered. She paused, her heart pounding. The air felt heavier here, oppressive, as if the building itself was alive and watching her. She reached the keeper's quarters, a small room at the top of the lighthouse. The walls were lined with shelves holding dusty books and rusted nautical equipment. In the center of the room was a desk, and on it lay an old journal, its leather cover cracked with age. Mia approached cautiously. The journal was open, its pages yellowed and fragile. The handwriting was spidery and uneven, the ink faded. December 31st, 1901, the entry began. The lights are wrong tonight. They dance where no ship should be. I hear them calling my name. Mia shivered. The words felt alive, as though Edward Harrow himself was speaking to her. She flipped to the next entry, dated New Year's Eve. They are here. They come with the tide. Their voice is louder now. I cannot leave. The beacon demands its keeper. The final line sent a chill down her spine. If you find this, it's already too late. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from below. Heavy, deliberate, they ascended the staircase, growing louder with each step. Mia froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then a whisper, faint, barely audible, but unmistakably coming from the direction of the staircase. "Leave." Mia's heart raced. She backed away from the desk, her flashlight flickering again. The room grew colder, the frost creeping up the windows. The whisper came again, louder this time, and filled with urgency. "Leave now." Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The light from her flashlight dimmed until it extinguished completely, plunging the room into darkness. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw it, a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadow, but its eyes, glowing faintly, like distant lanterns, pierced the darkness. The figure stepped forward, and Mia stumbled back, her hand knocking over the journal. The figure's voice was low, gravelly, and filled with something ancient. "You shouldn't have come." Mia scrambled to her feet, backing against the wall. "Who are you?" she managed to choke out. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed toward the window. Against her will, Mia's gaze was drawn to the glass. Outside, the sea churned violently, and the storm seemed to rage harder. But what caught her attention were the lights. Strange, ethereal orbs dancing just above the waves. They weren't natural. They moved with purpose, drawing closer to the shore, their glow casting an eerie light on the water. "They've come for you," the figure said, "just as they came for me." Mia turned back, but the figure was gone. Panic surged through her as the air grew heavier, the pressure making her ears ring. The symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer, their shapes shifting and writhing. The sound of water echoed up the staircase, though the sea was far below. It sloshed closer, accompanied by whispers. Hundreds of voices speaking in unison, their words incomprehensible but filled with menace. Mia ran. She didn't care where, as long as it was away from the voices, the figure, the lights. She stumbled down the staircase, her hands gripping the railing as the sound of rushing water grew louder. When she reached the base of the lighthouse, the door she had entered through was gone. In its place was a solid wall, the wood replaced by cold, damp stone. "No, no!" she cried, pounding on the wall. The water was inside now, swirling around her ankles, icy and relentless. The whispers grew louder, the words forming one clear, chilling message. The beacon must have its keeper. Mia screamed as the water rose, pulling at her, dragging her down. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the strange, glowing lights outside the window, their shapes forming into something impossibly large and grotesque. When the townsfolk ventured to Blackshore Beacon the next morning, they found nothing amiss. The lighthouse stood silent and empty, just as it always had. But in the keeper's quarters, they discovered an old journal lying open on the desk. The final entry, written in trembling handwriting, read, "The beacon has its keeper. Story the end."
Story number 5.
The snow fell in thick, quiet flakes as Emma drove cautiously along the winding road leading to the secluded cabin. It had been her family's tradition to spend New Year's Eve here, nestled in the mountains, away from the chaos of the city. This year, however, was different. It was the first time she'd returned since her parents' accident a year ago. The cabin, built by her grandfather decades ago, sat alone at the edge of Pine Hollow Lake. It was a place filled with memories, warm ones of laughter, bonfires, and holiday cheer. But tonight, as Emma parked her car and stepped out into the cold, the place felt different. The air was heavier, the silence oppressive. Emma shook off her unease. She was here to honor her parents' memory, to reconnect with the traditions they had cherished. She carried her bag up the icy steps, unlocking the door and stepping inside. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and cedar, just as she remembered, though the furniture was covered in sheets and dust clung to the corners of the room. After setting down her belongings, Emma busied herself with starting a fire in the stone hearth. The flames crackled to life, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She turned on the battery-powered lanterns she'd brought. There was no electricity out here. And unpacked her supplies. A bottle of wine, a small feast she'd prepared, and a photo album sat on the table, waiting for midnight. As the hours ticked by, Emma tried to relax. She played soft music on her phone, sipped wine, and flipped through the photo album, smiling at pictures of past New Year's celebrations. Her parents' faces stared back at her, their smiles bright, their happiness palpable. She felt a pang of grief, but also a sense of peace. This was where she was meant to be tonight. The first strange sound came around 10:30 p.m. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like a soft knock against the side of the cabin. Emma froze, listening intently. The wind had picked up outside, and she told herself it was just a branch brushing against the wooden exterior. Still, the noise left her unsettled. By 11 p.m., the knocking had grown louder, more deliberate. It came in irregular intervals, sometimes at the walls, other times near the windows. Emma checked outside, but the snow-covered landscape was empty, save for the dense forest that surrounded the property. Just the wind, she muttered, though her voice wavered. She returned to the living room and tried to focus on the fire, but the unease gnawed at her. The cabin's atmosphere seemed to shift. The air grew colder, despite the roaring fire, and the shadows cast by the flames seemed to lengthen unnaturally. At 11:30 p.m., the knocking stopped. Emma felt a brief sense of relief until she heard the faint sound of footsteps upstairs. Her heart leapt into her throat. The second floor of the cabin had been unused for years. She hadn't even gone up there to check it. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. She grabbed the fire poker and crept toward the staircase, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound amplified by the silence. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before her, lined with closed doors. Emma's flashlight flickered, and for a moment she thought she saw movement at the far end of the hall. She tightened her grip on the fire poker and approached the first door, pushing it open. The room was empty, filled only with old furniture covered in sheets. One by one, she checked the rooms, finding nothing out of place. But as she reached the final door, the sound of footsteps returned, this time coming from downstairs. Emma's blood ran cold. She turned, her flashlight illuminating the empty hallway, and hurried back down the stairs. The living room was just as she had left it, but the fire had died down to embers, and the air was frigid. She checked the front door. It was still locked. The windows were undisturbed, their latches secure. Then she noticed the photo album on the table. It was open to a page she hadn't looked at, and one of the photographs was missing. Emma's stomach churned as she flipped through the remaining pages, confirming her suspicion. The missing photo had been of her and her parents standing outside the cabin during a New Year's celebration. Her phone buzzed, startling her. She grabbed it from the table, but the screen displayed an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. At first, there was only static. Then, a voice, distorted, faint, but unmistakably her mother's. "Emma, why did you come back?" Her heart stopped. "Mom?" The line went dead. Emma's hands shook as she set the phone down. She told herself it was impossible. Her parents were gone. This had to be some kind of cruel prank. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The clock struck midnight, and the cabin seemed to exhale. The fire roared back to life on its own, the flames unnaturally bright. The knocking returned, louder and more insistent, accompanied by whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Emma backed away, clutching the fire poker. "Who's there?" she shouted. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and incomprehensible, until they resolved into a single, chilling phrase. You shouldn't have come. The front door slammed open, though no wind followed. Instead, a figure stood in the doorway. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured, but its presence filled the room with an unbearable cold. Emma couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, the whispers rose to a deafening roar. The walls of the cabin seemed to pulse, the symbols her grandfather had carved into the wooden beams glowing faintly. She remembered her father's warnings, stories he'd told her as a child about the spirits that guarded the land. "Leave this place," the figure said, its voice layered with 100 others. "You do not belong here." Emma stumbled backward, her legs shaking. "This is my family's cabin," she protested. "I have every right to be here." The figure tilted its head, almost as if amused. "Your family is gone. The cabin belongs to us now." The shadows in the room thickened, and the figure dissolved into them. Emma turned and ran, grabbing her coat and keys as she bolted out the door. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Fumbling with the keys, she started the engine and tore down the snow-covered road, glancing back only once. In the rearview mirror, she saw the cabin's windows glowing with an otherworldly light. The whispers still echoed in her mind, growing fainter as she sped away. When Emma reached the safety of her apartment, she collapsed on the couch, shaking and exhausted. She vowed never to return to the cabin, though she couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't let her go so easily. Days later, she received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was the missing photo from the album, but the image had changed. Where her parents had once stood beside her, their faces were now blurred, and shadowy figures loomed in the background, their eyes glowing faintly. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The wind howled like a living thing as Lucas made his way up the snow-covered hill. His flashlight barely cut through the dense mist that had descended on the small mountain town where his family's old house stood. It had been years since he'd returned here. He'd left for college, for the city, for a life far removed from the strange events that had once haunted his childhood. But something, an inexplicable pull, had drawn him back for this New Year's Eve. The house, an old Victorian mansion built by his great-grandfather, sat at the edge of the forest, isolated and towering. It had been abandoned since his parents sold it after his older sister, Clara, went missing on New Year's Eve 20 years ago. Lucas was only 6 at the time, but the memories were vivid. The screams, the shadows that didn't belong to anyone, the way the lights had flickered and died right before Clara vanished. He reached the porch, his breath fogging in the freezing air. The front door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing the dark, cavernous interior. The house smelled of decay and damp wood. Dust blanketed the furniture, and cobwebs stretched across the corners. Yet, as he stepped inside, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He had told himself this trip was for closure. He wanted to say goodbye to the past, to let go of the questions that had plagued him for years. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wanted answers. He wanted to know what had really happened to Clara that night. The living room was just as he remembered, with its grand fireplace and antique clock that had always chimed at midnight on New Year's Eve. The clock was silent now, its hands frozen at 11:45 p.m. Lucas set his backpack down on the dusty couch and lit a few candles, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. He wandered through the house, each creak of the floorboards echoing like a whisper. The family photos still hung on the walls, though the glass in many of the frames was cracked. One photo caught his attention, a picture of him and Clara playing in the snow, taken just days before she disappeared. Someone had scratched out Clara's face with deep, jagged marks. Lucas's stomach tightened. He took the photo down, staring at the defaced image. That was when he heard it. The faint sound of laughter. A child's laughter echoing from somewhere upstairs. He froze, the photo slipping from his fingers. The sound was distant but unmistakable. He told himself it was the wind, or maybe the old house settling. But as he stood there, straining to listen, the laughter came again, louder this time and closer. "Clara?" he whispered before he could stop himself. The laughter stopped. Lucas's heart pounded as he climbed the staircase, the air growing colder with each step. The second floor was darker, the shadows deeper, as if the light from his flashlight was being swallowed by the gloom. He made his way to Clara's old bedroom, the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, he found the room untouched. The bed was still made, the pink wallpaper faded but intact, and Clara's favorite stuffed bear sat on the windowsill, staring out into the night. But there was something new, a piece of paper lying on the bed. Lucas picked it up, his hands trembling. It was a drawing, crude and childlike, done in black crayon. It showed two figures standing by the house. One was clearly a child with Clara written above it. The other figure was tall and featureless, with unnaturally long limbs and dark eyes. Beneath the drawing were 3 words scrawled in jagged handwriting: "Midnight, it comes." A sudden bang downstairs made Lucas jump, dropping the paper. He rushed back to the staircase, his flashlight sweeping over the darkened hall. The bang came again, from the living room this time. He descended slowly, every instinct screaming at him to leave. But he had to know. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, he found the living room in disarray. The candles had gone out, and the antique clock was chiming. Its hands, frozen at 11:45 earlier, now read 11:59. The air felt charged, thick with an energy that made Lucas's skin crawl. The shadows on the walls began to shift, moving independently of the flickering light. One by one, they gathered in the center of the room, coalescing into a dark, amorphous shape. The clock struck midnight. The shadowy figure solidified, taking on a humanoid form. It stood taller than any person, its face a void of darkness with eyes that glowed faintly red. Lucas stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Lucas," the figure said, its voice a chilling mixture of whispers. "You came back." He couldn't speak, couldn't move. The figure stepped closer, and the room grew colder with each step. "Where is Clara?" he managed to choke out. The figure tilted its head as if considering his question. "She is with us now, as you will be." "No," Lucas shouted, finding his voice. "She's my sister! Give her back!" The figure reached out a hand, long and claw-like. The shadows in the room wreathed and pulsed, and the air filled with a deafening, otherworldly hum. Lucas backed away, but the shadows moved faster, wrapping around him like tendrils. "Clara is gone," the figure said, its tone almost mocking. "She belongs to the midnight now, and so do you." As the shadows engulfed him, Lucas felt a pull, like being dragged underwater. The room dissolved around him, replaced by a cold, infinite darkness. He could hear voices now, whispering his name, laughing, crying. And then he saw her. Clara stood a few feet away, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She reached out to him, but her hand passed through his like smoke. "Lucas," she said, her voice trembling, "you shouldn't have come." Before he could respond, the darkness surged, pulling him deeper. The last thing he heard was the chime of the clock, echoing endlessly. When the townsfolk found the house weeks later, they discovered no sign of Lucas. The only clue was a single drawing left on the living room floor. It showed 2 figures standing by the house, their faces scratched out, and the words "The Midnight Takes" written beneath it. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The year was ending, and the small town of Elkwood was wrapped in a heavy blanket of snow. It was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened, a forgotten speck on the map surrounded by dense forests and winding back roads. The residents were used to quiet winters, but this year the chill in the air seemed different, almost alive. It wasn't just the cold, it was something deeper, something that had settled into the bones of the town. Catherine had grown up in Elkwood, but left for the city in her 20s. She had sworn she'd never return, but life had a way of pulling her back. Her grandmother had passed earlier that year, and Catherine inherited the old farmhouse at the edge of the woods. She had put off coming back as long as possible, but when New Year's Eve arrived, she found herself driving through the snow, heading for the place she'd tried so hard to forget. The farmhouse looked exactly as she remembered, a stoic 2-story structure with peeling white paint and an overgrown yard. As Catherine stepped out of her car, the cold hit her like a wall. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears and made her uneasy. She grabbed her bag, trudged up the creaking porch steps, and unlocked the door. Inside, the house was dark and cold, the kind of cold that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Catherine flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. She sighed, remembering that the power company had warned her about the unreliable grid in this part of town. She set her bag down and lit the oil lamp her grandmother always kept in the foyer. The flickering light cast shadows that danced across the walls, bringing back memories she'd rather forget. The house felt the same, but different. The old furniture was still there, the same floral wallpaper, even the same smell of mothballs and lavender. But something was off, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Catherine chalked it up to being back after so many years. She wasn't used to the stillness, the isolation. She told herself she'd only stay one night and head back to the city in the morning. After unpacking, Catherine made herself a cup of tea and sat by the fireplace. She found an old photo album on the coffee table and flipped through it. The pictures were familiar, her as a child, her parents, her grandmother. But then she came across a photo she didn't recognize. It was of her grandmother standing on the porch, smiling, but there was something strange in the background. A shadowy figure stood at the edge of the woods, barely visible, but undeniably there. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. She closed the album and set it aside. It was almost midnight, and she decided to turn in early. Climbing the stairs, she noticed how every creak of the woods seemed louder than it should have been, echoing through the house. She passed the door to the attic, and for a moment, she thought she heard something behind it. A faint rustling, like someone moving around. She paused, listening, but the sound stopped. "Just the wind," she muttered, though the words felt hollow. She entered her old bedroom and closed the door behind her. The room was just as she'd left it. The same twin bed, the same faded pink curtains, even the same stuffed animals lined up on the shelf. She climbed into bed, pulling the heavy quilt up to her chin, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over her. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck midnight, its chime echoing eerily through the halls. Catherine closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. But just as she was drifting off, she heard it, a faint knock at the window. Her eyes snapped open, and she lay there, frozen. The knock came again, louder this time. She turned her head toward the window, the curtains fluttering slightly even though there was no breeze. Summoning her courage, she got out of bed and approached the window, pulling the curtain aside. Nothing, just the snowy landscape, the dark outline of the woods in the distance. She let out a shaky breath and returned to bed, telling herself it was probably a branch or an animal. But deep down, she didn't believe it. The knocking didn't come again, but the house felt wrong, as if it were holding its breath. Catherine lay awake, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion finally overtook her. She woke in the early hours of the morning to the sound of footsteps in the hall. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but the sound was too real, too distinct. Her heart pounded as she sat up, listening. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving toward her room. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. She got out of bed, grabbing the oil lamp from the nightstand, and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the air was colder than it had been before, biting against her skin. She shone the light down the hall, and her breath caught in her throat. The attic door was open. Catherine stood there, her mind racing. She knew she had closed that door. She stepped closer, her lamp trembling in her hand, and peered up the narrow staircase leading to the attic. The darkness seemed to swallow the light, and the faint rustling sound she'd heard earlier returned. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. No answer. Against her better judgment, she climbed the stairs, the boards groaning under her weight. The attic smelled of dust and decay, and the air was so cold it burned her lungs. The rustling sound grew louder as she reached the top. The attic was filled with old furniture, boxes, and cobwebs. In the center of the room stood a mirror, its surface cracked and clouded with age. Catherine's reflection was distorted, almost unrecognizable. But then she saw it, movement in the mirror that didn't match her own, a shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. When she looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. But her reflection was still wrong. Her face seemed hollow, her eyes sunken. She stumbled back, nearly dropping the lamp. That was when she noticed the box. It sat in the corner of the attic, covered in dust but strangely out of place. Something about it drew her in. She opened it, revealing a collection of old papers, photographs, and a journal. The photographs were all of her grandmother, but in each one, the shadowy figure from the first photo was present, always lurking in the background. The journal was filled with frantic handwriting, detailing strange occurrences in the house, whispers in the night, shadows that moved on their own, knocking at the windows. The final entry was dated December 31st, 1990, the night Catherine's grandfather had died. It read, "It's coming for me. Midnight is the threshold. God help me." A sudden gust of wind slammed the attic door shut, and the lamp went out, plunging the room into darkness. Catherine screamed, fumbling for the stairs, but the rustling sound was all around her now, closing in. She felt something brush against her arm, cold, clammy, and unmistakably real. She bolted down the stairs, her heart pounding, and locked herself in her bedroom. She sat on the floor back against the door, trying to catch her breath. The whispers started again, faint but growing louder. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling her head. "You shouldn't have come back," the voices said in unison. The knocking at the window returned, more insistent this time. Catherine covered her ears, rocking back and forth, tears streaming down her face. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and then, just as suddenly, they stopped. The silence was worse. Catherine sat there, afraid to move, until the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains. She gathered her things and left the house without looking back. Months later, she sold the farmhouse, but the nightmares never stopped. She would wake in the middle of the night, hearing the knocking, the whispers, the rustling sound, and in the mirror above her dresser, she would sometimes see it, a shadowy figure standing just behind her. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The New Year's Eve storm rolled in fast, dark clouds blotting out the moon and plunging the quiet countryside into near total darkness. Rain lashed against the windows of the old boarding house, a decrepit building that sat at the edge of an abandoned orchard. The house, known locally as Ravenwood, had a dark history. It had been uninhabited for years, its crumbling structure a shadow of its once grand presence. But tonight, Ravenwood wasn't empty. Emma, a 27-year-old freelance journalist, was spending New Year's Eve in the house to write a story about its haunted reputation. She had stumbled across old newspaper clippings that spoke of tragic deaths, strange disappearances, and unexplained phenomena linked to the place. Most of the locals avoided Ravenwood, dismissing the rumors as superstitions, but a few claimed the house was cursed. Emma didn't believe in ghosts, but she couldn't resist a good story. She had arrived earlier in the afternoon, armed with a camera, a digital recorder, and a flashlight. The air inside the house was damp and heavy, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the corners. As the storm raged outside, she set up her gear in the parlor, a once elegant room now stripped of its former glory. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture was covered in dust, and the fireplace was choked with soot. Emma checked her watch. 11:15 p.m. She had plenty of time to gather notes before midnight, the hour when, according to legend, the house woke up. That was when the strange occurrences were said to peak. Whispers in the walls, shadowy figures in the halls, and doors that locked themselves. She clicked on her recorder and began narrating her observations. The storm adds an unsettling atmosphere to an already eerie location. No signs of paranormal activity yet, but the night is young. As she spoke, the sound of a floorboard creaking upstairs interrupted her train of thought. Emma froze, her heart skipping a beat. She stared at the ceiling, listening. It could have been the house settling, or an animal. She grabbed her flashlight and decided to investigate. The stairs groaned under her weight as she climbed to the second floor. The long hallway stretched out before her, lined with doors that led to the house's bedrooms. The air was colder here, and her breath came out in soft puffs of mist. She moved cautiously, shining her light into each room. They were all empty, filled only with broken furniture and cobwebs. But as she reached the end of the hall, she saw it, a door slightly ajar, its hinges squealing softly as it swayed in the draft. Emma hesitated, a knot of unease forming in her stomach. She pushed the door open, revealing a bedroom that looked different from the others. This room was oddly pristine. The bed was made with fresh linens, a vase of wilted flowers sat on the nightstand, and an old-fashioned mirror hung on the wall. It was as if someone had been living here, or still was. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She stepped closer to the mirror, her flashlight beam reflecting back at her. That was when she noticed it. In the mirror, a shadow moved across the room, behind her. She spun around, the flashlight trembling in her grip, but the room was empty. Her breathing quickened as she turned back to the mirror. Her own reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. The reflection of the door behind her was closed, even though it was still open in reality. "What the hell?" she whispered, stepping back. The sound of the door slamming shut made her scream. She whipped around to see the door was now closed. Her flashlight flickered, and the air in the room grew impossibly cold. A low whisper filled the room, faint but unmistakable. "Leave," it said, "before it's too late." Emma's heart pounded as she scrambled to the door, fumbling with the knob. It wouldn't budge. The whisper grew louder, now joined by the sound of footsteps approaching the room. Desperate, she slammed her shoulder against the door, and it finally gave way. She ran down the hall, her footsteps echoing as the whispers followed her. Reaching the stairs, she practically leapt down them, nearly losing her balance. The parlor felt like a sanctuary compared to the oppressive atmosphere upstairs, but the feeling of safety was short-lived. The fireplace roared to life, flames erupting without any kindling or spark. The room filled with an acrid smell as the firelight danced across the walls. The shadows it cast didn't match the furniture. They moved on their own, twisting and writhing like living things. Emma grabbed her recorder and camera, intending to flee, but the front door slammed shut before she could reach it. The whispers were everywhere now, growing louder, overlapping into an incomprehensible cacophony. She spun around, trying to find the source, but the shadows were closing in, forming a dark humanoid shape in the center of the room. The figure stood motionless, its face a void of darkness. Then it spoke, its voice a chilling mix of whispers and growls. "You should not have come here." "I'm sorry," Emma stammered, backing away. "I'll leave, I swear." The figure tilted its head as if considering her words. The flames in the fireplace grew taller, the room shaking as if the house itself were alive. Then, with a voice that seemed to echo in her very bones, it said, "You cannot leave. The house has claimed you." Emma turned and ran for the kitchen, hoping to find another way out. The back door was locked, but she grabbed a chair and smashed it against the window. The glass shattered, and she climbed through, cutting her hands on the shards. The storm outside was fierce, the wind and rain nearly blinding her as she stumbled into the orchard. The trees loomed like skeletal hands in the darkness, their gnarled branches clawing at her as she ran. She didn't dare look back, the whispers still echoing in her ears. She didn't stop until she reached her car, parked a quarter-mile down the dirt road. Fumbling with her keys, she jumped in and started the engine, peeling away from the house as fast as the slick road would allow. She didn't stop driving until she was miles away, the lights of Ravenwood long behind her. She pulled over to catch her breath, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. She glanced at the recorder, still clutched in her hand, and hit play. The whispers were there, faint but audible. But they weren't coming from the house. They were coming from the back seat. Emma slowly turned her head, the blood draining from her face. Sitting in the back seat was the shadowy figure, its glowing eyes fixed on her. The last thing she heard was its voice, low and final. "The house is with you now." Her car was found the next day, abandoned on the side of the road. There was no sign of Emma, but her recorder was still running, capturing the faint sound of whispers in the wind. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The winter air bit sharply as Hannah stepped out of her car, the crunch of fresh snow beneath her boots breaking the silence of the isolated mountain road. It was New Year's Eve, and despite the festive mood the world celebrated, Hannah wasn't here for celebration. She was here to confront the past, and perhaps the supernatural. The cabin stood at the edge of the woods, its outline barely visible under the waning light of the day. It had been 15 years since she'd last set foot there. The last time she'd been here, she was a teenager, celebrating New Year's Eve with her parents and her younger brother, Sam. That night had been the happiest and the darkest of her life. By morning, Sam was gone, vanished without a trace. No signs of struggle, no footprints in the snow leading away from the cabin. Just gone. Her family had searched for months, and the police had investigated every lead, but Sam was never found. Some people whispered that he had been taken by the forest. Others said the mountain had its own way of claiming what it wanted. Her parents never recovered from the loss, and the family had slowly fallen apart. Now, 15 years later, Hannah was back. She had no logical reason to return, just a series of dreams that had started a few weeks ago. Dreams of Sam standing in the forest, calling to her. His voice was faint, but insistent, growing louder each night until she could no longer ignore it. She didn't believe in ghosts or premonitions, but something about the dreams felt real. Too real. The cabin was exactly as she remembered it. The dark wood siding, the stone chimney, the frosted windows. It looked like it had been frozen in time, untouched since her family's last visit. Hannah unlocked the door, her breath visible in the icy air as she stepped inside. The interior was cold and musty, the faint smell of pine and decay hanging in the air. She set her bag down and lit a fire in the stone hearth, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the room. She had packed lightly, just some food, a flashlight, and a notebook. She planned to stay until morning, just long enough to shake the feeling that had haunted her since the dreams began. As the fire crackled, Hannah sat on the worn couch and pulled out her notebook. She began jotting down her memories of the last time she was here, trying to piece together anything she might have missed. The laughter of her brother as they played in the snow, the warmth of her mother's cooking, the sound of fireworks exploding in the distance as the clock struck midnight, and then nothing. Just the empty silence of a New Year's Day without Sam. The hours passed slowly, the cabin growing colder despite the fire. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows and making the trees groan. Hannah checked her watch. 11:30 p.m. The dreams had always ended just before midnight, and she felt a creeping unease as the hour approached. She decided to go outside. Maybe the fresh air would clear her head. Wrapping herself in a thick coat and scarf, she stepped out onto the porch. The forest was eerily quiet, the snow-covered ground glowing faintly under the light of the moon. The wind had died down, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. As she stood there, she heard it. A faint voice carried on the cold air. It was distant, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the trees swaying, but it was there, a child's voice calling her name. Hannah. Her blood turned to ice. She turned toward the woods, straining to hear. Hannah, help me. It was Sam's voice. She was sure of it. The sound came from deeper in the forest, beyond the edge of the cabin's property. Her rational mind told her it couldn't be real, but her heart wouldn't let her ignore it. Grabbing a flashlight, she stepped off the porch and into the snow. The forest closed in around her as she walked, the towering trees blocking out the moonlight. The flashlight beam illuminated her path, but the shadows seemed to shift and dance just beyond its reach. The voice grew louder, guiding her deeper into the woods. Hannah, please, she called out, her voice trembling. Sam, is that you? There was no reply, only the sound of her own breathing and the crunch of snow beneath her boots. She kept walking, her fear giving way to determination. If there was even a chance, no matter how small, that it really was Sam, she had to find him. The air grew colder as she ventured further, her breath freezing in the air. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their gnarled branches reaching for her like skeletal hands. The voice was louder now, almost pleading. Hannah, don't leave me. She stumbled into a clearing, the snow untouched and pristine. In the center stood an old well, its stone structure covered in frost. The sight of it stopped her in her tracks. She remembered this well. It had been here 15 years ago, though her parents had warned her and Sam to stay away from it. The voice was coming from the well. Hannah! Her heart pounded as she approached, the flashlight beam illuminating the dark opening. She peered inside, but the light didn't reach the bottom. The voice echoed up from the depths. Help me. She knelt by the well, her hands gripping the icy stones. Sam, are you down there? The voice didn't answer. Instead, a sudden gust of wind blew through the clearing, extinguishing her flashlight. She gasped, fumbling to turn it back on, but the darkness was suffocating. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, and she felt a presence behind her. Slowly, she turned. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the faint moonlight. It was a boy, no older than 10, wearing the same red coat Sam had worn the night he disappeared. Sam, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at her with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Hannah took a step closer, her hands trembling. Sam, it's me. I'm here to bring you home. The figure tilted its head as if confused, then opened its mouth. The voice that came out wasn't Sam's. It was something else, something ancient and wrong. You shouldn't have come back. The words sent a wave of terror through her. She stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the well. As she hit the ground, the figure began to move toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Hannah scrambled to her feet and ran, her flashlight swinging wildly as she fled back through the woods. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches clawing at her coat and hair. She could hear footsteps behind her, getting closer. She burst out of the woods and into the clearing where the cabin stood, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her mind racing. The figure hadn't followed her, but the sense of dread lingered. The fire in the hearth had gone out, leaving the cabin in near total darkness. She grabbed her bag and dug out her phone, but there was no signal. Desperation clawed at her as she tried to think of what to do. The whispers started then, faint but unmistakable, coming from all around her. Hannah? Hannah. She backed into a corner, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an incomprehensible chorus. The air grew colder and the shadows in the room seemed to move on their own. The front door creaked open. Hannah froze, her eyes locked on the door. The figure stood in the doorway, its hollow eyes glowing in the dark. It stepped inside and the whispers stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. The figure raised its hand, pointing at her. Its voice was a low, guttural growl. "You cannot escape." Hannah screamed as the figure lunged at her. The last thing she saw was its face, Sam's face, twisted into a grotesque mask of rage and sorrow. The cabin was found weeks later by a group of hikers. The firewood was neatly stacked by the hearth, and Hannah's belongings were still inside, but there was no sign of her. The only clue was a single word scratched into the wall above the fireplace: run. To this day, locals say that if you stand by the old well on New Year's Eve, you can hear a voice calling for help. But they warn you not to answer, because once the forest claims you, it never lets you go. Story the end.
Story number 10.
It was the final day of the year, and the town of Glenford, a quiet little place nestled in the hills, looked like something out of an old postcard. The streets were covered in snow, and the lampposts had sprigs of holly wrapped around their bases. Families were preparing to welcome the new year, and most of the townsfolk were gathered at the community center, where the annual New Year's Eve celebration would take place. The energy was festive, but not for everyone. Maggie Monroe stood outside her family's home, staring out at the horizon. The sun had dipped behind the hills, and the last rays of light were fading. Her breath came out in frosty puffs as she wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders. She wasn't in the mood for the party, for the noise, for the forced cheerfulness. For months, the anniversary of her brother Luke's disappearance had haunted her thoughts. And now, with New Year's Eve upon them, the pain had come rushing back. Luke had vanished without a trace 3 years ago, just days before New Year's. He had gone on a hike alone in the woods outside of town, and the search parties that had combed the area had found nothing. No clues, no signs, just the absence of him. The police never managed to make sense of it, and the town had slowly moved on, except for Maggie. She couldn't. She never could. Over the past few weeks, the dreams had started again. Dreams of Luke calling her from the woods, his voice faint but desperate. Every time she woke, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something was unfinished, something was still waiting. But her family had been the first to stop looking. Her mother was a shell of herself, lost in the grief of her son's disappearance, and her father buried himself in work. Maggie was the only one who hadn't let go, and tonight, on the anniversary, she had made a decision. She was going to search again. She turned toward the house, her footsteps crunching on the snow. Her mother was inside, preparing for the party she didn't want. Maggie didn't care. She couldn't bring herself to celebrate the turning of another year without Luke, and she knew she wouldn't be able to face the people who had given up on him. She'd been pretending for too long, pretending everything was normal, but it wasn't. She grabbed a flashlight and a jacket, and without another word, she walked out the door. The cold air hit her like a slap in the face, but she didn't care. The town had all but forgotten about Luke, but Maggie would never forget him. She headed toward the woods, her breath quick and uneven as she walked through the darkening streets. The woods that bordered Glenford had always been a place of mystery and folklore. People talked about strange things happening there, whispers in the trees, shadows that moved on their own, and people who had gone in and never come out. Maggie had always dismissed it as superstition, but the stories seemed to become more real now, especially on nights like this. On New Year's Eve, the forest took on an eerie stillness, like it was holding its breath. But Maggie couldn't stop herself. If there was even a chance that Luke had left behind some clue, some sign of where he went, she would find it. As she entered the edge of the woods, the trees seemed to close in around her. The moon was barely visible through the branches, and the air was thick with silence. Every step she took seemed to echo in the vast emptiness. Her flashlight flickered and then died. She cursed under her breath, fumbling with it before giving up. She would have to rely on the dim light of the moon for now. The path ahead was familiar, and her mind drifted back to the last time she had walked this way, before everything had changed. Luke had been with her, laughing as they tried to navigate the winding trails. It was supposed to be a fun afternoon hike, but she had never seen him again after that. She walked deeper into the woods, her breath coming faster, the cold now biting at her skin. The further she went, the more she felt a sense of unease, like she was being watched. The wind picked up, sending a chill down her spine. She pulled her coat tighter and continued walking, the sound of her footsteps crunching in the snow the only noise. It wasn't long before she found herself at the old abandoned cabin. It was a dilapidated structure that most of the town had forgotten about. It had been abandoned for years, and no one knew who had built it or why. The windows were boarded up, the door hanging off its hinges. Maggie had never liked coming here, but tonight, something drew her toward it. She hesitated before stepping closer. As she reached for the door, she felt a strange sensation in the pit of her stomach, a feeling like the air itself was charged with electricity. She paused, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest, and stepped inside. The inside was dark, save for the light that filtered through cracks in the walls. Dust hung in the air, undisturbed, and the floorboards creaked beneath her feet. The air was stale, and the silence was thick. As Maggie moved deeper into the cabin, her eyes adjusted to the dimness. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something about this place felt wrong, as if it had been waiting for her. She stepped carefully through the room, her gaze scanning the corners. Then she saw it. In the farthest corner of the cabin, half hidden beneath a pile of old, rotting wood, was something that caught her eye. It was a small wooden box, intricately carved, its edges worn with age. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. It was familiar. She had seen this box before. It had been Luke's. Her hands shook as she picked it up. The box was cold, too cold to be just wood. She ran her fingers over the carvings, feeling the faint grooves beneath her skin. There was no mistaking it. This had been Luke's box, the one he used to keep his most prized possessions in. She opened it, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, there was a single piece of paper. Her name was written on it in Luke's handwriting. "Maggie, I'm sorry. Don't come looking for me." The words were simple, but they sent a wave of cold terror through her. The message didn't make sense. Why had Luke left it here? What was he trying to tell her? She couldn't understand, but the sense of dread that had been building inside her was now overwhelming. She dropped the box and backed away from it. The door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, her heart racing. The room was now completely dark, the moonlight no longer able to penetrate the thick, oppressive blackness. Then she heard it, a whisper, soft and distant at first, but growing louder. "Maggie, come closer." Her breath hitched in her chest. The voice was Luke's. She had to be hearing things. She had to be. But then the whisper came again, clearer this time, and she could hear the desperation in it. "Maggie, please." She took a step back, her pulse pounding in her ears. The air was thick with the sound of her own breathing, and her mind raced. She knew she should leave. She knew she had to get out of there, but she couldn't stop herself. She moved toward the voice, toward the darkened corner of the room where she had felt the pull earlier. As she reached the corner, she froze. There, in the shadows, was the figure of a boy, small, familiar, Luke. He was standing still, his eyes hollow and empty, his face pale, his clothes torn. He didn't look like the Luke she had known. He looked wrong, twisted, like something had taken him and reshaped him into something else. "Maggie," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry." Before she could react, the figure lurched forward, grabbing her by the wrist with a strength that felt inhuman. Her breath caught in her throat as the world around her began to blur, the edges of reality warping. She struggled, but the grip tightened, pulling her closer to the figure. "You should never have come," the voice said, but it was no longer Luke's. It was something darker, something malevolent. The last thing Maggie heard before everything went black was the sound of footsteps coming from behind her and the faint whisper, "Happy New Year." Story the end.